There is a certain type of person who enters your life with a wound that seems authentic, a story that seems urgent, a silent plea for help that feels impossible to ignore. You believe that if you give enough love, if you listen with enough patience, if you sacrifice just a little more of yourself, they will finally awaken. But Carl Jung understood something most do not have the courage to face. Certain people are not looking for someone to heal them. They are looking for someone who will agree to be the vessel for the pain they refuse to look at. And the most disturbing part is that you were taught to call this love. You are not exhausted because you love too much. You are exhausted because you have assumed, without realizing it, the psychological role that this person refuses to fulfill. They do not need to change as long as there is someone willing to suffer in their place. And this is where the Jungian inversion begins to sting. The problem was never a lack of love on your part. The problem was that your love became fuel for the other person's inertia. This video is about the people you should never have tried to save, and about the invisible price you pay for continuing to try. There is a silent moment, almost invisible, when someone stops giving. It is not an announced decision. It is not accompanied by a speech, a farewell, or an elegant explanation. It is merely an internal withdrawal, almost imperceptible to the other and devastating on the inside. From the outside, those who have always received see only coldness. They call this new version distant, selfish, changed. They cannot see that what they interpret as cruelty is, in truth, the first breath of lucidity from someone who spent years emotionally financing a relationship where only one side carried the weight. You know this moment. It is when you realize that the call you are going to answer has become an obligation, when the message that once brought you joy began to drain you, when you understood that your patience was not a virtue, but a psychological contract signed in silence, in which you agreed to endure in exchange for being loved. And the darkest part is that no one notices this moment happening, not those who exploit you, and often not even yourself. It is only noticed later, when exhaustion speaks louder than guilt. It is not coldness, it is recognition. It is not abandonment, it is weaning. It is not malice, it is the end of the theater in which you acted as an inexhaustible source for those who treated you as a resource. Jung used to say that most human suffering is the refusal to see what we have known for a long time. And when that veil falls, what remains is not anger, it is a lucid and surgical pain. The pain of realizing that what you called love was in many cases a sophisticated form of emotional submission. You weren't loving, you were maintaining. You were sustaining. You were carrying someone who settled onto your shoulders because they discovered, early on, that your shoulders never complained. And here psychology becomes relentless. Certain people do not choose whom to love. They choose who can endure. They do not do this with conscious malice, and that is exactly what makes the pattern so difficult to identify. There is an unconscious radar, almost animalistic, that detects in another human being the willingness to absorb. A radar that sniffs out those who feel guilty for saying no, those who confuse utility with identity, those who were trained from an early age to believe that being loved is a direct consequence of being useful. It is no coincidence that the same types of people always appear in your life. It is not bad luck. It is structure. You emit a psychological frequency of infinite availability, and the world, cruelly practical, sends you exactly what that frequency invites. Friends who only call when they are sinking, family members who only remember your name when they need something, partners who confuse your stability with an exemption from their own emotional responsibility. You have become the emotional adult for a circle of people who refuse to grow up, and every gesture of your generosity has functioned as a license for them to remain exactly where they are. Limitless generosity does not produce gratitude. It produces dependency, and dependency in a short time disguises itself as a bond. When you begin to withdraw, the other person does not feel a sense of longing. They feel the loss of the service. They do not feel the loss of your soul. They feel the loss of your support. And that is why the most common accusation against those who begin to set boundaries is that they have changed. You haven't changed. You woke up. And waking up, for those who benefited from your sleep, is always a betrayal. That is why I prepared O Código do Despertar for you. If you have made it this far and are feeling that silent discomfort, that visceral recognition that you spent years sustaining people who would never sustain you back, this sign is not weakness. It is the beginning of individuation. O Código do Despertar is a 60-day inner map built on the psychology of Carl Jung, one lesson a day, with keys, questions, and declarations that will pull you out of paralysis and return you to your axis. You read, you perform the micro-action, you write in your journal, and you feel the change happening from within. The guide is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you have already understood that you need to begin this crossing, write a single word in the comments: woke up. This symbolic commitment is the first step toward you ceasing to be a warehouse and becoming the subject of your own life again. There is a silent part in all of us that resists until the last moment, accepting what the body already knows. And the body, that honest translator of the unconscious, begins to signal long before consciousness does. It is the insomnia after that conversation. It is the tension in the jaw when their name appears on the screen. It is the slight nausea before a family dinner. The organism, wiser than the mind trained to please, begins to reject what the soul sustains out of obligation. And when you ignore these signals, they do not disappear, they accumulate. They transform into chronic fatigue, into inexplicable irritation, into a sadness without an address. Here we enter the most uncomfortable territory of Jungian psychology, the mask. The persona is that version of yourself carefully constructed to fit the molds that guarantee acceptance. It is not malice, it is survival. You learned while still small which parts of you were well received and which were silenced, ridiculed, punished. And so you edited yourself. You hid your anger, swallowed your disagreement, disguised your limits, smiled when you wanted to scream. Over time, the mask stuck so firmly that you forgot the face behind it. The exhaustion you feel after being around certain people is not physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself to keep others comfortable. The problem is that the persona isn't just yours. Others use theirs too. And certain people have built masks so efficient that they have become literally incapable of seeing their own selfishness. They aren't faking. They truly believe they are generous, attentive, loving, even when the practical evidence of their behavior screams the opposite. That is why confronting these people rarely works. You aren't talking to a conscious adult. You are talking to a mask that needs to stay intact so that the entire building of their identity doesn't collapse. And that is where the shadow comes in. Everything a person refuses to recognize in themselves, the selfishness, the manipulation, the envy, the affective incompetence, does not disappear. Buried things do not die. They leak. They stay stored in the shadow, silent and patient, and find an exit through the front door of the other's consciousness, projection. This is why, when you begin to withdraw, you are called selfish by the person who has been selfish with you your whole life. This is why those who never prioritized anyone accuse you of prioritizing yourself too much. It isn't irony. It is pure psychology. The person isn't lying. They are using you as a screen to project what they refuse to see within themselves. You are not cold. You became the mirror. And most people wound those who refuse to distort their own reflection. That is why change is never well received by those who benefited from your stagnation. Those who grow alone grow against the family that preferred you predictable, against the friendship that fed on your erasure, against the partner who confused your silence with peace. There is a dangerous illusion that sustains unbalanced relationships for decades. The hope that one big fight, one decisive confrontation, one revelatory conversation will finally open the other person's eyes. You wait for the cinematic moment of change. Except real change almost never arrives that way. It arrives in silence, through the side door of exhaustion. It isn't the scream that changes everything. It's the accumulated fatigue of always justifying. It's the day you look back and realize how many times you manufactured elegant explanations for someone's unacceptable behavior. You invented reasons. He's going through a difficult time. She has always been like this, it's just her way. His childhood was complicated. She had no role models at home. These phrases were not understanding. They were psychological crutches you manufactured so you wouldn't have to face the harder truth. Some people are not confused. They are not lost. They are not blocked. They simply found in you a system of absorption so efficient that they never needed to face the consequences of themselves. And this is what Jung would call individuation being born through the wound. The moment the excuse stops serving its purpose, the moment you realize that infinite patience was not a virtue, it was anesthesia. You weren't forgiving, you were postponing. You weren't understanding, you were avoiding. And when the anesthesia wears off, what is left is a pain so precise that it becomes information. The pain shows you, with no room for negotiation, that people change when they want to, not when you want it for them. No one carries anyone into their own consciousness. Everyone only enters there on their own 2 feet. And at that exact point, when the last excuse falls away, O código do despertar becomes urgent. You cannot make this crossing alone, fumbling in the dark, hoping to find the way by accident. The guide is in the first pinned comment, with 60 days of inner mapping, 1 lesson a day so you don't retreat. The decision must be today. Tomorrow the mask sticks again. No one goes back to the same place after seeing. That is why many people prefer not to see. That is why most people choose comfortable ignorance over painful consciousness. But you, who are here, listening to this point, have already crossed an invisible line. Ignorance is no longer an option. You already know. And what is known cannot be unknown. The moment comes when the only way out presents itself, the limit. And here lies one of the most silent pains of individuation. For someone who built their identity on utility, saying no feels like a small death. Every time you refuse a request, something inside you whispers that you are being selfish, cruel, unnatural. That whisper is not your conscience. It is the echo of an old programming, installed by voices that needed your eternal availability to survive. Setting a limit is not about building walls. It is about finally recognizing that you are a person before you are a service, that your emotional resources are finite, that your peace is not a negotiable byproduct of others' comfort. The integration of the shadow in this context has a very precise meaning. It is accepting that there exists in you the capacity to disappoint others, and that this capacity is not a failure. It is proof that you exist as an individual and not as an extension. You need to understand something cold and liberating at the same time. Disappointing people who only fed on your surrender is not a character flaw. It is a sign of psychic maturity. Those who demand that you never disappoint anyone are demanding in practice that you never truly exist. Because to truly exist is to have a boundary, and to have a boundary is, inevitably, to bump into someone who preferred you without form. Not because you got worse, but because you ceased to be useful in the old format. Not because you hardened, but because you finally stopped bending until you fractured. And people, especially those who confused your lack of boundaries with kindness, will react as if you have committed a crime. You haven't. You merely recovered from the state of emotional servitude in which you confused your own erasure with virtue. The interesting thing is that, on the other side of this discomfort, there is a new breath, an unexpected lightness. The energy you previously spent manufacturing explanations, postponing confrontations, and sustaining falsehoods begins to flow back inward. And the body gives thanks before the mind does. You start to sleep better, to eat with more pleasure, to listen to a song and truly feel it. It is the organism finding its own rhythm again after years of being synchronized with the urgency of others. But here a resistance appears that must be named clearly. The idea that history guarantees access, that shared time is a perpetual debt, that blood is a contract, that an old friendship is a lifelong pass for your patience. None of this is true, and pretending it was is what kept you trapped for so long. Sharing history with someone only means that you occupied the same space-time. It does not mean that this person deserves to remain in your life in every new version of yourself that you become. People change, you change, and some relationships only worked because you were a previous version of yourself, a version that was more bendable, more silent, more hungry for approval. Maintaining these bonds out of chronological loyalty is a sophisticated form of cruelty against oneself. Family is not a justification for recurring disrespect. Old friendship is not a passport for emotional abuse disguised as intimacy. A partnership of many years is not a license for someone to confuse your tolerance with an irrevocable contract. What grants access to your life is not the past. It is consistent behavior in the present. Only that. And when that criterion begins to apply, much that seemed sacred begins to show its skeleton. Some bonds will survive this sifting. They will surprise you. People you thought were distant will prove to be closer than the supposedly intimate ones, and other bonds will crumble into dust, showing they were never made of love, but of convenience. This is not a tragedy, it is a revelation. Better to lose an illusion than to sustain a prison. And it is here, exactly here, that your responsibility becomes non-transferable. No one is going to make this crossing for you. No book you merely read will replace daily practice. No inspired phrase in a post will reconfigure the pattern that has been set for decades. O Código do Despertar exists precisely for this, to transform consciousness into routine. 60 days, one lesson at a time, with keys, questions, and declarations that force you to act. The guide is in the first pinned comment. You can keep promising yourself that one day you will change. Or you can start today now before the mask adjusts itself over your face again. The choice is yours. But those who choose to postpone have already chosen to stay exactly where they are. But there is one last pain, perhaps the most silent of all, waiting for you at the end of this road. It is the pain of grief. Not grief for someone who is gone, but grief for who you were. For all the versions of yourself you sacrificed trying to remain acceptable. For the child who learned that love is earned through utility. For the teenager who kept quiet so as not to lose affection. For the adult who spent years performing a calm they did not feel, so as not to disappoint those who never had the courage to truly look inside. There is a specific sadness when you realize how many years you spent trying to be enough for people who were never going to be satisfied. How many conversations you repeated in your head, trying to explain in a gentler way something that shouldn't have needed explanation. How many nights you spent reorganizing feelings that the other person refused to consider. That time doesn't come back, and part of maturing is accepting that it was spent, not wasted, spent, because it was that time, exactly that time, that brought you to this point of lucidity. You haven't lost the capacity to love. You have simply stopped confusing love with silent sacrifice, with voluntary invisibility, with the compulsion to solve what was never yours to solve. Real love does not consume you. It returns you to yourself. It does not demand that you erase yourself so that the other may shine. It happens between two whole presences, not between a presence and a shadow that serves. Directing love with consciousness is not being cold. It is being precise. It is recognizing that your energy is a finite and sacred resource, and that investing it in those who despise it is a form of blasphemy against yourself. The right people will appear in your life when you stop doing emotional casting for positions that no one asked to fill. And those right people will not demand that you prove anything. They will simply remain without demanding performance, without charging sacrifice, without transforming your presence into an obligation. You have already heard everything you needed to hear. What comes next will be your decision and yours alone. You can close this video, go back to the same circles, fit the mask back on, and continue financing with your soul the inertia of people who will never recognize the price you pay. Or you can accept that the illusion is over, that the theater has closed, and that there is a concrete path to rebuild everything from within. The guide is in the first pinned comment. From here on, either you follow who you were, or you begin to become who you truly are. There is no middle ground. Choose.